Hello. Hi. So, welcome back. Thank you for coming back. That's always a good start. So I think there's a few more people are going to mail in over the next few minutes, but we'll get going in the interest of keeping to the schedule. So I kind of gave a bit of a precursor to this session beforehand. Hopefully that's whetted your appetite. But this is going to be a two-part presentation, and the first will be delivered by my colleague, Professor David Emerson, and then I'm going to take over the second part, which has been produced in conjunction with the current CoSeC director, Barbara Montanari. And then we'll have time for questions after that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dave and we'll get going. Thanks.
Hi. Good afternoon, everybody. So this is really a brief look back at the creation of the CCPs, how it came about, what they started doing, and I'll take it up to the point where CoSeC comes into the picture, and Stephen will take it over from there to talk about the more recent things. So let's try to get the technology working. Yay! I'm quite conscious that from the back this is difficult to see. But it's basically a timeline trying to take in contributing factors towards what became the CCPs and the whole sort of program that started. And it goes in part right the way back to the 1960s, when two crucial reports come out. There's the Robbins report, which I'll explain a bit more about later, and the Flowers report, which was very much about computing. In the 60s, you have to think there's very, very different climate for how things were done, how things were looked at, and the role of computing, which in the 60s was pretty minimal. It also coincides with the creation of the Atlas Computing Laboratory, which started around about 61, became operational in about 64. And they have another key role which plays alongside how the CCPs came about. So just to give an indication, so we say, what are the CCPs? Well, collaborative computational projects. And this is taken from a little report done by Professor Paul Durham. So Paul was the director of the Theory and Computational Science Division when I joined in 1990. And he wrote a little report for something called ERSIM. I think it stands for the European Research Community on Informatics and Mathematics. It doesn't exist, I don't believe, anymore. But this was written in 1996, summarizing some of the concepts of what they were. And it was really to bring together researchers to tackle a significant computational challenge, typically too big for a single institution or person. And just looking at the ones about what they were doing typically for CCPs was implement flagship code development projects. So you have a big code, which was at the time still quite novel. Maintain and distribute code libraries, organize training in the codes, hold meetings, workshops. They used to have overseas researchers coming over for lecture tours and visits. And they used to do regular newsletters. The newsletter, by and large, has pretty much faded away. I think it's still done with one or two of the current CCPs, but it's largely disappeared. But there was no internet as such at the time. So the newsletter was posted out on a quarterly basis to the all of the people who were registered. At the time when Paul wrote this, there were 12 active CCPs. The two missing from here are CCP 8 on nuclear structure and CCP 10 on plasma physics, which were no longer active for whatever reasons they were at the time they ceased. They might have achieved what they wanted to do. They might not have been able to secure additional funding, but it covers a lot of the CCPs that were originally thought of by Phil Burke and other people in areas they wanted to tackle. One of the later ones was the one I was involved with, CCP12, on high-performance computational engineering. So each CCP had a chair. It's very much the same today, but we tend to be working now on slightly different versions where you have a PI who's looking after it. And they would have a working group, which is usually like a management group these days. And we also have a slight difference now, because here we just had the CCPs, but today we have the CCPs and the high-end computing consortia are the two activities that we sort of tend to support. So when did they begin, and what really contributed to their creation? We have to look back, as I said, back into the 60s when things were changing. We were coming to the end of the baby boomer, so there was a lot of people coming into the sort of age group that they'd want to go to university. So there was a lot of societal changes, and there was a lot of technology changing as well. Computers were becoming usable, and people wanted to make access to them. And just over 60 years ago now, a report by Sir Lionel Robbins, who was the head of the London School of Economics, published something in 1963, which is still used even today by modern governments as a sort of role for how they want the universities to be. Running alongside that was this Flowers report in 1966, where the demand for computing in universities was quickly outstripping anything available. And they wanted to try and find a way to resolve that. So the three bits that I'll look at just to start on how it gets going is this report by Robbins, the report by Flowers, and the coincidental thing that was going on with the Atlas Computing Laboratory. So Flowers, it's really difficult to think today what university life was like back in those days. It was really quite different. And Robbins wrote a report for the government of the day, and which ended up with something called what they now refer to as the Robbins Principle. And this just states that courses of higher education should be available for all those who are qualified by ability and attainment to pursue them and who wish to do so. And there are two reviews of the report by Nick Hillman and Nicholas Barr, looking at the implications and the impact of this. Robbins didn't make any change to what was happening with universities at the time. There was already quite a lot of universities being planned and coming online in the mid-60s. But the principle underpinning this about everybody who has the ability to go is important. There were far fewer universities. There was only about 25, which was a mix of the old universities, so the Oxford, Cambridge, and places like that, and the red brick universities like Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool. And this meant that very few students actually went there. It was about 4%, 4 out of every 100 went to full-time university courses. And out of that, the working class contingent was very, very low. About 1% of the people were working class girls and about 3% boys. So a very low sort of level of entry for people going into full-time education. And that was a mix of universities, polytechnics, and technical colleges and stuff that were around. It seems obvious to us today that this makes sense. People who are skilled enough to go, but it actually did get a lot of criticism with letters being sent into the Times. And universities were convinced more means worse, and that they're already scraping the bottom of the barrel, were phrases used to say that they don't want to sort of expand them. The reality is that they did expand, and by the time you get into the 70s, it's roughly doubled the number of students getting full-time education, which is great. And a lot of these people then want to do newfangled things like computing. So the Flowers report was another instrumental one because he wrote the report because looking at computing and the impact in science. And the idea that he had was to enable regional centers to be created. So in 1969, as a result of this, Manchester University had a regional computer center created. And they set up lots of these centers throughout the UK in response to the report. So you had one in Wales and places like that. And they were suggesting that we start buying larger machines, 10 to 15 larger US machines, and about 100 times more powerful than the IBM of the day, which was also codenamed as Stretch, to meet the expected demand. You've got a combination of more people going to university, more people interested in computational work, and you're going to try and have the universities be able to help satisfy this demand. Running parallel to this was the creation of the Atlas Computing Laboratory, which started being built in 61, ran to about 75 before it was then taken into the Rutherford Laboratory and became a part of a division there. It was quite pioneering in its day and was doing lots of software development. Areas of particular strength were mathematics and chemistry. I would love to say computational engineering, which is my field, was in there. It wasn't. It wasn't doing anything. It housed a Ferranti Atlas computer. So this was in a day when the UK was equal to anywhere else in the world in creating computers. And so Ferranti, who no longer exists, they were bought up, for those who want to know, they were bought up by GEC, who totally botched it and lost everything. And Ferranti were lost as a company. But at the time, they were really quite a powerful and good company. The design was from Manchester University. And for a short time, it was regarded as the most powerful computer in the world. Computational chemistry was a major driver of the software developments. And actually, from people who were involved in the chemistry side who later come into the CCPs, you have people like Vic Saunders, who wrote code for the to solve Gaussian integrals in Fortran 4. A long time ago, I remember Fortran 4. Good. And he joined in 1970. And there's a good review article by Smith and Sutcliffe of several other groups like Manchester, Oxford, and Cambridge, also active doing university developments in chemistry. And another one that's also well known to the conference is Martin Guest. Martin joined the Atlas Computing Lab in 1972. What was happening then was that in 1975, as I said, it was closed down. And that then allowed some of the people from there to join Daresbury and join what was then the Theory and Computational Science Group. And this had a big impact in the creation of the CCPs. So if we now look a little bit further on in the timeline, we're now getting into the 70s. And this is where we start seeing the embryonic part of the CCPs, and this was in an area where they called it Project 1. This was to eventually become CCP 1. And I'll just run through how this comes about. Because over this time period, we've gone through multiple research councils as well. When this was going on, it was just the Science Research Council, and they were around from 65 to 81, and they were responsible for just about all the public science that was funded in science and engineering. What had happened, and something we don't see so much today, but the Atlas Lab was speaking directly with the Science Board, and they led to this idea of a meeting house, which is a term that is never used anymore, and I've not found anybody who actually knows what it truly means. And it's attributed to one of the major scientists of the day, a Professor Ron Mason. But it was basically, I think of it like a mini sandpit where you bring together a small number of scientists who are quite distinguished, and then you discuss a particular topic, in this case, chemistry. This was all coordinated by Jack Howlett, who was the director of the ACL. And they proposed that they have a meeting focus on molecular correlation errors in theories which surpass the Hartree-Fock theory in accuracy. And then it brought together 4 leading professors of the day. One of them couldn't make it, which was Coulson. He was replaced by Murrell from Sussex. Some people in the audience will know who these people are. It's too long ago for me and not in my field. But they came together and came up then in February 1974 with Project One, which was supported. So this was really good. You're seeing direct interaction with the Science Research Council and the Science Board there, talking directly with the scientists out here. The criticism that's held on this type of approach is it's a very top-down approach, because what you've got is a small number of people, all very eminent scientists, all very, world-leading in their field. But it's then dominated by their view of what needs to be looked at. We wouldn't recognize this today. It doesn't happen, really. It would be a much broader community coming in. But at the time, this was quite common, where you'd have quite a high-level top-down approach of what was going to happen. So this is in 1970s, we start getting this concept emerging. Project One was given the go-ahead by the Science Research Council. It was supported. They had a working group. The working group didn't like the title, the working group, so they called themselves a steering panel. And they met in 74, and they agreed a PDRA to be supported. So quite typical. They met again in 75, discussing outputs. And a key topic related to codes and the machine dependence. And so it's quite interesting this morning hearing about libraries being ported, software being ported. We've still got similar problems today. They didn't care about reproducibility there. They were just really trying to say, can we get an answer to the problem? But today we've got other things, and anybody who's tried installing complicated libraries knows that it's a complete pain, and you go to a different machine, you've still got painful work to do to try and do it. So this coding, and this group was working and talking about software porting. Remember, you've got the Flowers report and the impact from that of all of these regional computing centers. They start having computers in there which are different and need to be having the codes ported to them. So they had another meeting, and the next phase of work decided on valence bond techniques and recommended to the Science Board and approved for 3 years at a meeting then. But there were things, as I mentioned already, that were changing externally, which was the imminent closure of the Atlas Computing Laboratory and the subsequent move of some very key personnel up to Daresbury. So as we move on with this, we start seeing Phil Burke, Professor Phil Burke. He was leading, he was part-time at Daresbury, leading the division. He was also at Queen's University in Belfast. But he was also a senior member of the Science Board as well, and highly regarded, very influential person. And he organized a meeting of the steering panel at Daresbury in late 77. And from this, the concept of the collaborative computational projects were proposed. And following the staff move from the Atlas Centre up to Daresbury, there was a study weekend. Engineering would never work on a weekend. Physics and chemistry do this kind of thing. You go on a weekend and do it. Never do it. So Phil Burke, and he introduces and defines the program. And what I put up before from Paul Durham, they renamed Project One as CCP1, and the principles behind that of what Phil wanted to see with this was this bringing together of the community, working together collaboratively to tackle challenging science problems and develop the software. So CCP1 in the chemistry mode was sorted. Then in the following year, they had CCP2 on continuum states in atoms, CCP3 on surface science, CCP4 protein crystallography, in 79, CCP5 came about in 79, and CCP6 came along as well. So we're starting to see some of the names that I put up earlier from Paul's list are some of the ones that in the formative years of the CCP program. So there was another key moment that bit of serendipity, bit of being sort of in the right place at the right time and doing the right thing with the software. And what happened then was the Cray 1. So the mid-70s was a period of really quite dramatic change in hardware. Seymour Cray, who's pictured here with his wife, this is, I believe, at Daresbury with the Cray 1S there. I don't know the other people, so I can't confirm it, but it was a picture that I found that said it was there. So this was, the Cray 1 was delivered to Daresbury. And you can argue that this is quite a pivotal point for some of the CCPs. And because some of the CCPs are really looking at pushing the frontiers with the computing capability around. And the Cray system was really quite a revolution. And it's very difficult to understand these days how powerful it was, but a huge change. And it was, again, chemistry leading the way on this. So frustrating. Vic Saunders and Martin Guest, they ported all the Atmel codes, and they did that within a month, which was quite an achievement. And they got a speed up of 16.2. And this was relative to the computer that was at Manchester, which was the CDC 7600. So the good thing here, CCP1, because it was already working together, had really talented people working in there. They were in an ideal position to quickly embrace this new technology. And it really made a big difference in they were able to quickly reap the benefits, and the community could quickly benefit from these performance improvements. And as I put down there, sadly not true for engineering. We were still thinking that we can have a little VAX system on our desk or something like that and not do any big science. Most sad. Anyway. So when we go into the 1980s, this is a really powerful era for the vector computers, because you go from the Cray 1, you get to the Cray XMP, the Cray YMP. So I did my PhD in the 80s. By this stage, the UK had totally lost the plot on computing. We no longer did computers. It was dominated by the US. And the US in particular were making huge progress with scientific sort of developments. And if you ever want to look at it, there's a really nice book on supercomputing and the transformation of science by William Kaufman and Larry Smarr. Their background, from what I recall, was astrophysics, but the huge impact that you had from the Cray systems. One of the things that was really useful at Daresbury, and certainly when I joined, we had quite a few quirky parallel systems. We had an Intel IPSC 2 and an IPSC 1. We also had an Intel Hypercube, an IPSC 860. They came out in these periods. There was, for those who've heard of Amdahl's law, Amdahl's law was a really negative view of computing. If you've ever looked at his paper, which came out in 1967, it basically said if you've got any percentage of serial component in your software, you are fundamentally limited to the scale up to essentially the inverse of the sequential part. Which would mean that if you had something like 1% serial in a code, then no matter how many processors you had, you'll never get past 100 speed up on that. And this paper sort of permeated everything, because people thought, well, what's the point of building computers with large numbers of processors? They're not going to be any use. We can't get any speed up with them. But there was still lots of us nerdy people like parallel computing, so people did develop ideas on there. But it did take a long time before there was a definitive paper which came out by Gustafsson that showed that he was looking in the wrong way. Amdahl's law is real. If you have a fixed size problem and keep throwing more and more processors, you will get a problem with it. It's what we call now strong scaling. But the way that Gustafsson looked at it was that we don't want a fixed size problem. We're going to actually look at bigger, more challenging problems. Oof, that'll be tough. But anyway, so the emergence of scientific computing, this today is standard. When I was doing my PhD in the 80s, it wasn't. There was hatred between experimental people doing work and people doing computational work. It was continuous, quite vitriolic exchanges at meetings about these things. And there was a nice quote by Bill Smith and a paper done by some colleagues where a theorist is supposed to have referred to computing people as hairy-handed mahouts operating elephantine computers. The one I particularly like is poor old Kawaguchi, who was a Japanese researcher in '53. And he was doing a finite difference solution to flow past the cylinder. And he said the numerical integration took about 1.5 years with 20 working hours every week with a considerable amount of labor and endurance. So that's what it was like. He later goes on to using computers in the 60s and completely, there is another funny one, which I won't go into because of time, but yeah. So my work starts around about CCP 12, which is in 1990. And it was a recognition by the engineering board that there was a poor take-up of HPC for the engineering researchers. On the YMP, it was about 4% was related to the engineering. And the success of the CCPs and the route was shown as the route to follow. So CCP 12 started. And we were going to investigate parallel and novel architecture computing. So I'd just done my PhD at Manchester. I'd been probably the heaviest user of the vector systems they had there, and then moving on to using some of the parallel systems and learning about those. The engineering board of the day also acquired a number of computers to distribute. Some Mako systems went to Bath and Bristol. Some shared memory systems went out as well. So in the defense of what we did in CCP 12 and how we did it, we grew from 4% back in 1990 to when we had HBCX at Daresbury. We were up at 37% of the activity was then in the engineering side. So I did work very well. But the 1990s was a nice era as well. There was a report by Professor Richard Catlow, which looked at research requirements for high-performance computing. And this was done in 1992, and it was looking at where are things going. Vector computers were they were very expensive, really good and easy to use by this stage, but very, very expensive to have. And they could see no growth for how you could get to tackling really large scientific problems at a cost that was manageable. And it was within this sort of framework that Richard Catlow looked towards the future with looking at parallel computing. And this was the thing that then started saying, well, we need to move to distributed memory systems, which was at the time very challenging. We had very, very few codes in the UK that could use such a system. We didn't have MPI. MPI 1 was released in June '94. So there were very few standards, or if any, and very few codes running on them. But a decision was taken that that's what we were going to do. And so we purchased the Cray T3D. My code was one of the benchmark codes for the procurement. And today, what we did to access the system is something that people will recognize today, is the consortia model. Today, we have the high-end computing consortia. This originated with the Cray T3D, where access to the system was done almost like a European model, where you bring together the community. So the CCPs were an ideal model for trying to pull these things together. And it was all tackled through this consortium model. Going beyond that, well, the 1990s saw some major developments going on. We had the Accelerated Strategic Computing Initiative. Basically, HPC was taking off for a lot of the science communities, and vector machines were really consigned to the past. So coming up to the last bit, because by the time we get to 2000, most of the codes are running in parallel in all fields. We'd sort of broken the back of it during the 90s. And so we were then moving into taking parallel computing as a default way to go. What we saw then in the 2000s, well, first petaflop calculation by IBM, but it's also a good example of the challenge we face today with these machines being difficult to program. Today, we have hybrid architectures with GPUs for accelerators. We have shared memory, multi-core systems, and the memory hierarchy and the technology is quite challenging to work with. You had the same with IBM, because they were trying to do that with the processor from the PS3 with one of the IBM processors. They got LinPack running. I can't think of any other code that ever ran on it, and I've never heard of one. Just too difficult. The CCPs continued to evolve, changing demands for the communities. Within the engineering, the consortium model that was established there kind of faded out for a bit. We carried on with it, and it worked very well. So the longest running one that I can think of in that mode was the UK Turbulence Consortium. It started being funded in '94, and it continues to run very successfully today with a growing number of people on that. And we're tackling things on tier 2, tier 1, Archer 2, and tier 0 in the EU and US on those facilities. So many of the CCPs are involved in exascale initiatives like Excalibur. But as I mentioned, the programming challenge remains. It hasn't gone away from IBM breaking the petaflop down. So with this bit, I'm going to hand over to Stephen, because at this point we get to 2017, which is when CoSeC comes along, because the CCPs aren't just the CCPs anymore. They're the mix of CCPs and HECs and other things. May I borrow your mic? You may, but I have no idea how to get it off. No, I didn't put it on. See how it decouples on.